Okay, 1 Corinthians chapter 10 is where we are going to be. We are in the last month of this quarter. That is hard to believe, but we are on the home stretch of our study of 1 Corinthians. If you did not get material that takes us through the rest of this quarter, those will be available up here on the front pew and on the visitors table in the back. We handed out weeks 10, 11, and 12. That will take us through next week and the last 2 weeks of this quarter. And so be sure to get a copy of that. It's a packet of 3 lessons. For our purposes this morning, we are in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. We have repeatedly come back to 1 Corinthians 3, verses 10 and 11, where Paul describes himself as a wise builder, building on the foundation of Jesus Christ, encouraging saints in Corinth to be careful how they build on that foundation. And we've entitled this whole quarter, Saints Under Construction, because these were brothers and sisters in Christ. They were our brethren, and many of them, of course, have gone on to their reward. But we understand there are basic practical lessons here, because we are not perfect just like they were not perfect. We've got progress to make just like they had progress to make. We need to mature just like they needed to mature. And so we've broken this down thematically. We talked in week 1 about how as we build, there must be no divisions among us. We must not go beyond what is written. The church must be kept pure. We must learn to get along. We must use our bodies to glorify God. We must lead the lives that the Lord has assigned. We must guard against pride. And then last week, we must not put obstacles in the way of the gospel. What we have is 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Now in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, we've simply entitled this, We Must Adamantly Avoid Idolatry. That's what much of 1 Corinthians chapter 10 is all about. In the first 5 verses, we've got a rather incredible paragraph, because it is not something that we typically think about as we go back and read Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 1, I want you to know, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now, he's going to go on to talk about how these things were recorded for our instruction, for our learning. He's going to reassure us of that 2 times in the next few verses. But he's taking us back. He's taking these people back, and in a sense taking us back to the Old Testament. We think about some of those things many of you have been studying on Wednesday night with Jason and with David here in the auditorium. Your study of the book of Exodus, it continues, of course, in Leviticus, especially in the book of Numbers, and then into Deuteronomy. You think of these Old Testament descendants of Abraham who've been delivered by God out of Egyptian bondage, led out into the wilderness, and Paul is encouraging these Corinthians to think about that with one foundational point in mind. You remember that they all were provided by God. They all had food to eat, and they all had water to drink. But God was not well pleased with them. Now, we'll talk about this statement in verse 5 in just a moment. What do you make of what we read in verse 4? They drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. The way the majority of us read the Bible is we go back and we read Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and this is all about God the Father, the Lord, Yahweh, the one who was and is and always will be, and it's all about those Old Testament stories and everything, and we don't really think about Christ until we come to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so what do we make of 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 4? What is Paul saying there, do you think? Guy, go ahead.
I just had a thought, and maybe it was the wrong one.
Go ahead.
No, what that is. Go ahead.
Okay. Anybody else? What do you think Paul is saying in verse 4? Gordon?
Well, John tells us that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so it goes on and explains that's Jesus. And so they had the Word of God there in the wilderness. Christ was with them.
Yeah.
Christ, God the Son.
Okay. John chapter 1, like you referenced, certainly gives us the idea Jesus was pre-existent before creation, right? It's not that God went from Genesis to Malachi and then said, okay, I need a new wrinkle on things, and so he created God the Son. John chapter 1 tells us he has always been and always will be. Alan, go ahead.
In John chapter 6 and verse 31, he says, our fathers ate manna in the wilderness as it is written. He gave them bread from heaven to eat. Jesus then said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread.
Okay? So Jesus takes those people back to that era of Moses, and we know, of course, if we keep reading, he compares himself to the bread of life, right? He takes them back and reminds them of that manna that came from heaven in the wilderness, and then draws this powerful parallel to himself being the bread of life. We get the idea, undoubtedly, that Christ, the Son, was active in the Old Testament. There are other places that we could go to. It's not that for all of eternity, God the Son was lying dormant until what we read of in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But in a powerful way, God is working. God the Father, God the Son, God the Spirit. We could go back and look at examples of the Spirit as well, being active in the Old Testament. For our purposes right now, Paul wants us to understand even Christ knew what was going on. Christ was involved. And now on this historical side of the cross, we're hanging everything on the work and the revelation of Jesus Christ. But this is all a part of God's plan. Okay? You in Corinth, we in 21st century Ohio have a part in God's plan just as surely as those people did in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And the specific point in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 is, listen, there were people who were God's people, who had communication from God, who were provided for by God, who walked with God, and yet they didn't give God the honor and the respect and the obedience that he was due. Therefore, verse 5, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. And the thread that Paul is attaching here from those people all the way to Corinth is, God is speaking to you. And you can walk with God, and God is providing for you. And you've got tremendous blessings at your fingertips. But if those people in the Old Testament could enjoy those things and God not be well pleased with them, guess what? You can enjoy all of those wonderful things and God not be pleased with you. And guess what? We can follow that thread all the way into our own context. just like there were people in the Old Testament, just like there were people in Corinth who enjoyed many good things and were even a part of the people of God, that doesn't necessarily mean that God is pleased with the way that we are living. Isn't that the major point as we begin what we have as 1 Corinthians 10? Dee, go ahead.
Well, we're living that way today. We drink of the rock, and there's people who still does.
Absolutely.
He's not pleased with that either.
Yeah.
In fact, the ones that drink of the rock, he's not pleased with their acts.
Yeah.
So that's still today.
No doubt about it. There were people who drank the water that God sent from a physical rock and afterwards disobeyed God. And God dealt with them, right? We're going to note a little bit of that in the next paragraph. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, Moses, his great song of Moses, compares God to a great rock. But just because God was a rock that these people could build their lives on didn't necessarily mean that they were doing what God would have them to do. Jesus, of course, in Matthew chapter 7, his great illustration of building on the rock. Whoever hears what I'm telling them to do and does it will be like building a house on a rock. Okay? And of course, we do that, but that doesn't necessarily mean if we just mentally, spiritually check out and do whatever it is that we want to do, God is pleased with that. He begins to get practical in verse 6. He says, now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. He's going to walk us through several different things. Number one, these people desired evil. There are many examples of that in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We think we could go back if we had the time to Numbers chapter 11, where the beginning of that chapter tells us there was this rabble among the people who had a strong craving for meat. They were not content with the water and the manna that God was providing. And so God causes quail to fall on the ground, feet thick, and they begin to eat it. And Numbers tells us while it was in their very teeth, God sent a plague among them. One of many examples that we could go back and look at. He says in verse 7, do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. As you read verse 7 as a Bible student, what do you think of from that era, the Old Testament era?
Golden calf.
Golden calf. Exodus chapter 32. What we're reading, that quote in verse 7, is actually from Exodus 32 and verse 6. The people rose up and began to play around this golden calf. And we know how that turned out. He says in verse 8, we must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. It's not hard to go back and find what's being talked about there. Numbers chapter 25, the beginning of the chapter tells us that the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. And they sacrificed different things to the Moabite gods in connection with sexual immorality with these pagan women of Moab. And God sends a strong plague upon them. Verse 9, we must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents. Anybody remember what Paul is referencing? Where do we run across serpents in connection with those Old Testament people? Do you remember?
Genesis.
Numbers.
Okay, of course in Genesis we've got the very first instance of the serpent. But what did you say?
Numbers.
Yeah.
What, 20, 21?
Numbers 21. Fiery serpents that come down, right? The people are complaining. They say, why did you bring us out of Egypt? Their minds have become very, very, very selective. Their memories are a little twisted, right? They talk about how we had plenty of bread and plenty of vegetables and plenty of meat in Egypt, meat in pots in Egypt. And of course, we go back and read Exodus, and it wasn't quite like that, right? But they say, why didn't you just leave us in Egypt? Why didn't you leave us to die there? Or why didn't you allow us to already die in the wilderness? And God sends these fiery serpents, and God tells Moses to set up that one bronze serpent. Once again, we've got connections there to Jesus. We could go back, if we have time, where Jesus in the Gospels talk about just how Moses set up that bronze serpent in the wilderness, that he himself was going to be raised up on behalf of the people. Paul says they were we must not put Christ to the test as some of them did. Verse 10, we must not grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Over and over and over again we read about grumbling on behalf of these people. The point is, Paul says, look at what happened. These were God's chosen people. He delivered them. They were separated from bondage. You think about the undercurrents here, the spiritual parallels. These people were separated from bondage in Egypt. Christians in Corinth, separated from bondage. Passing through the water, just like he says in the first few verses, passing through the waters of the Red Sea, versus these people having been separated, liberated from bondage through baptism. God providing innumerable blessings for these people, making sure they had what they needed to thrive. These Old Testament people being brought to a promised land. These people being delivered from bondage into this promised inheritance. But just because God had delivered them didn't mean they could live in whatever way they wanted to live. Okay? This is not a much more modern Calvinistic way of looking at salvation, is it? Calvin doesn't come for 1,500 years after Paul writes this. Okay? Paul doesn't believe once you're delivered, now you live in whatever way you want to live because you're delivered for all time and you're secure. No, there's a life to be lived. A life of holiness and faithfulness to God. A life of being so very thankful for what he has done, but trembling at his holiness. Look at what happened to these people. Now, in verse 11, anytime we run across words like now or therefore or then, after a discourse like this, he's bringing us back out of history and making an application. Now, these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. What do you make of that last phrase? In what way have Christians, in what way has the end of the ages come upon Christians? Guy?
I was going to say a few minutes ago that in reading this story many, many times in the past,
Yeah.
this is the most ungrateful people.
Absolutely.
But I think of every story in the Bible, these are the most ungrateful people. And to fight God throughout the trial.
No doubt.
And they ended up being punished.
And one of the basic points I think that Paul wants us to see is they didn't get it. But if anybody ought to get it, it is we, Christians, who now live in the age of the fulfillment of God's plan. Right? I mean, these people were recipients of great blessings, but they were living in the very middle of the fulfillment of God's great promises to Abraham. Right? I mean, they're smack dab in the middle of all of it. God comes to Abram and says, I will make you a great nation, and I'll give that nation a land to live in, and through your seed, all of the nations of the earth will be blessed. Okay? They're right in the middle of all of that just beginning to come to pass. Paul would have us to understand that has happened. What was unfolding in the days of these people, we live in the age of the fulfillment of that. We live in the age where all of these prophets of God longed to see how all of this was going to work out. We see fully with our own eyes what David and Elijah and Isaiah and Jeremiah, as far they would get on their prophetic tippy toes and as far off as they could see, they couldn't see what you and I can see. We've got the big picture. If anybody ought to understand, it's us. And yet, here were people in Corinth, as Dee has brought out, here are people in our own context who don't grasp it. Therefore, in verse 12, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. I mean, that's the point, right? These people thought, because of what God did to the evil Egyptians, well, now we have arrived. And of course, as long as they obeyed, there was a blessing. If they disobeyed, there was a curse. The ball was in their court. They got to decide how they were going to live. And the point for Christians is, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. Why do we have such a tough time remembering that and living that?
Because we're tempted all the time.
Okay.
Satan hasn't quit.
Okay, yeah. I think that's a great segue. Temptation hasn't stopped. Look at verse 12. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. Okay? Just like, Dee brought up Adam and Eve. Just like Adam and Eve, just like Cain and Abel, just like Abraham, just like these people that we're reading about in the Old Testament context, just like David, just like Peter and James and John and even Paul, temptation comes. And temptation continues to come. Temptation is universal. But here's this great promise, the latter part of verse 13. God is faithful. Now we go back and we read Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those people, like Guy has brought out, were not faithful. But at any step along the way, did God cease to be faithful to those people? Not at all. God does not turn his back on those people. God does not let them down. God does not leave them destitute. God is faithful. And God is faithful to Corinthian Christians, and God is faithful to Ohio Christians just as surely as he was to those Old Testament people. And he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. What is God telling us? Alan?
There's 2 Peter and 2, and most of that chapter is very good to read.
Yeah.
Starting maybe the 9th verse, he said, Then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trial and to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment.
Okay. God is able to deliver. That's what Exodus is all about, right? God is able to deliver. What is God telling us? We know about God. What is God telling us?
I'm your friend. I'm your God.
Okay.
I'll take you to heaven.
Okay. If what? If you learn the lessons of the past, right? He is a great God. He is holy. He is just. He is everywhere, and he's all powerful. He makes the so-called Egyptian gods look just as foolish as the very idea of them was, right? But it's up to us to choose how we're going to live. And God's not going to force us to do anything, right? He's going to allow us to choose how we're going to live just as surely as he did those people, and just as surely as he did the Corinthians. And if I choose to walk in the ways of ungodliness, if I choose to practice sin, who can I blame? Nobody but myself. I can't blame God. Because God not only provides, but He makes sure whatever temptation comes my way, it is not greater than my ability to bear it. He makes sure that with every temptation, every single one, there is a way of escape. But He's not going to pick me up and shove me through that door. He asks me to choose the way of holiness, right? Ed, go ahead.
Yeah, I like that where it points out in verse 13, no temptation has overcome you except such as common to man. A lot of times today we try to rationalize, well, they don't know what I'm going through. You know, they didn't go through, my parents didn't go through what I'm going through, or my grandparents didn't see that or whatever. But here we see sin is pretty much the same. It may wrap up different, but it's been around for a long time.
There's nothing new under the sun. Right? And John, in 1 John, does a magnificent job of showing us that very thing. How was Eve tempted? The lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. Right? And John talks about the same three well-worn paths. What I see that is forbidden, what I can do that God has told me not to do, and putting too much stock in myself and not enough in God. The trappings, the wrapping, the bow that's put on top evolves over the centuries, but it's still the same basic things. Therefore, he says in verse 14, my beloved, flee from idolatry. At its root, this is all about putting something in front of God, right? That's idolatry. Taking God out of the position of prominence and putting something else that I'm going to worship or myself in that place, right? Whatever you want to talk about with those Old Testament people, in one way or another, it was idolatry. The only instance of idolatry wasn't the constructing of that golden calf. It was, we think our time in Egypt was better than this. Therefore, why didn't you just leave us alone? We think our masters in Egypt were better than the master you have set over us now. Let's kill Moses and go back to Egypt. Or in Corinth, any number of different things that we've talked about over the course of these first 9 chapters that's going on, where I put myself or something else in the position of prominence. Paul says, recognize idolatry, turn around, and run. And as you're running, run some more. It is a vivid Greek word that is in the present active tense that means run and keep on running and don't stop running. Flee from idolatry. I speak as to sensible people. That's a theological way of saying you know better, right? You know what I'm saying is true. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. Consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices participants in the altar? What do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No. He went back in chapter 8 and established the fact idols aren't anything. No, I imply that what pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Those Old Testament people provoked Christ to jealousy, right? They put him to the test. Are we stronger than he? Look at how, just like Ed has brought up, there is nothing new under the sun. God has delivered you. He has provided for you. He has revealed himself as holy, and he wants you to be holy. But you've got a choice as to how you're going to live in Corinth. And if you try and have one foot in the Corinthian culture and one foot in the world, or one foot in the kingdom, it's not going to go any better for you than it did for those Old Testament people in the wilderness. All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. Paul, we've already talked about the context of that, right? That the food these people would eat was to be eaten with thanksgiving. The food that was offered, an idol is no such thing. Whether I eat or I do not, he has developed already, doesn't commend me to God. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. And so now in verse 24, we're going to continue or return to the thread that began in verse 8. It's not about me. It's first about God, and then it's about other people ahead of me. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. You eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. Why? The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. God created the earth. He has provided food. Eat the food, understanding that an idol is no such thing. But in verse 27, if one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, don't eat it. For the sake of the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience, I do not mean your conscience, but his. For why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I give thanks? What he wants to make sure these people do not do is give the impression you can worship a pagan idol, and I can go along with that as if it's not a big deal. If it's food and there isn't any connection whatsoever to an idol, eat it. God provided it. But if in any way there is some way that it can be conceived that you're going along with idolatry and paganism and the worship of demons, you be holy. You be distinct. You be set apart as God is holy. Finally, verse 31, let's wrap it up. Whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. That has been the point in chapter 8, 9, 10, and it's going to continue to be the point. It's not about you. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. Thank you for being here this morning. Lord willing, next Sunday morning we will be in chapter 11. If you did not get material that takes us through the rest of this quarter, that's available up here on the front pew. Please be sure to get a copy of that. Thank you for being here.